The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. And we say hello to Amel Ahmed, an associate professor of political science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and author of Democracy and the Politics of Electoral System Choice, Engineering Electoral Dominance. Amel Ahmed, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. And Amel, you recently wrote a piece for the Washington Monthly titled Why We Should Rethink Voting Rights from the Ground Up. And you point out that we tend to think about voting rights as a negative right. What does that mean, and what makes it, as you describe, faulty?
Well, I think thinking of voting rights as a negative right essentially puts us in the framework of protection from harm. And those are the kinds of demands we make of the state to protect us from harm in exercising our right to vote. And it comes down to protection from intimidation, obstruction, and all those things that would make the franchise less equal. And that's, of course, really important. But in that piece, what I'm trying to do is trying to reimagine what it would look like if we thought of voting rights as a positive right. And that would take us away from protection from harm and put us more in the framework of making demands on the state that empower us with the resources we need to secure our well-being. So makes it, more of an affirmative right to vote. And I think that's something that is very much lacking in how we approach voting rights in the US. And I think that has a lot to do with how voting rights have evolved. We have no right to vote within the Constitution. That has never been the case. There have been attempts to establish it, but they've not been successful. And subsequent efforts to assert a right to vote have usually referred back to the Equal Protection Clause. And so again, that's really making demands that the state protects us from discrimination, making sure that we have equal access to the franchise. But it really is silent on whether or not we are actually able to exercise that right. And so that is what I am hoping to do by moving this into a different framework where we think of it as an affirmative right. And we think of the state as providing for our welfare rather than just protecting us from harm.
And you would think that would be something that everyone could agree on, and sadly, it's not. In fact, you argue that a truly progressive agenda would treat voting rights like economic rights. So what's the benefit in this approach?
I really like economic rights as a framework for many reasons. Number one, because economic rights are also not guaranteed in the Constitution. But it gives us a model for how something that we don't have any, constitutional guarantee for, we can still make these demands. And it really, economic rights have been hard won through advocacy, through mobilization, social movements that have increasingly made clear the costs of not having these rights and built up a consensus that this is something that we are owed just as a condition of human welfare. And given how important voting rights are, I think we can also shift to a similar framework. I think, I also appreciate the economic rights framework because it thought in terms of how to bind politicians to specific outcomes and not rely on their own sense of fairness and political efficacy. And I think that's a really important way to approach this. There are many principled politicians who are committed to voting rights advocacy and the protection of rights. But to my mind, that is not a stable basis for something that's so essential to our democracy.
Mm-hmm. And right now, voting rights advocates are pushing for the passage of H.R. 1, the For the People Act, as a way to protect elections. What do you see as the limits and possibilities of this act when it comes to an affirmative right to vote?
Well, I'll say, first of all, HR 1 is a kind of massive, sprawling bill with lots of things within it. Many of those things still are within the framework of negative liberty. And, the negative rights are important. Protection from harm, protection from discrimination are still critically important. So that's a part of HR 1. But it goes beyond this, I think, in really useful ways. So provisions such as introducing automatic voter registration, secure mail-in voting. And there are many tweaks to election administration. They seem like minor tweaks, but they actually really help improve and streamline in-person voting. And so, when you think of this as a positive right, I actually think of really concrete, mundane things. I think through my own day. I think through, elections that come and go. And I'm someone who is very well versed in electoral politics and in voting rights. And it's hard for me to keep up. It's hard for me to integrate it in my daily activities. And I'm constantly surprised that, local elections, which are critically important, it's hard to get information about what's happening. It's hard to even keep track of the deadlines and registration. And there are lots of things about voting that are complicated and confusing, even if you're paying attention. And so I think of this really in very concrete terms, how to make it easier for people to get the information they need and to get out there and really execute that right that they have in reserve. I think one of the major limits of HR 1 is that, I think the framing doesn't give us a sense of why all of these things are coming together. And that's been a limitation. It seems like, a whole, array of things that I think it's been described as a wish list for voting rights advocates, but it really shouldn't be. If we can understand it in terms of what is required for voting rights as a positive right, it makes a lot more sense why these things are being brought together. And so I think it's really important that we consider what's happening at the level of political imagination. In addition to the practicalities and the logistics, people need to be able to make sense of why these things are being brought together. And I hope that we can articulate this more clearly as a push for an affirmative right to vote, not just the defensive posture that we often take.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned as HR 1 is this massive bill with all sorts of things about it. Does it make sense, or is it maybe this the only way to get any sort of election protections passed? But does it make sense to then just do a standalone all by itself? Here's what we have to do: streamline how people have the right and get to vote, or is that an impossible task given how so many people seem to be against letting people have an easy way to vote?
I think I would absolutely. That would, in my mind, be progress if we could just figure that out. But one of the biggest challenges for the US is that our election administration is so very decentralized. So even streamlining that process is, that would require its own 700-page bill. So there are things that unless we're willing to establish some kind of agency that's paying attention to this, it's going to be very difficult. And we really don't have a central agency that's managing this. We approach voting as this kind of laissez-faire enterprise where different localities are managing it in different ways, and different individuals are responsible for providing their own information, collecting their own resources, and figuring out how they're going to get to the polls. And so, one of the things that really struck me in the past presidential election 2020 is how much we did to help facilitate voting given the conditions of the pandemic. And it made clear how much support people need on a regular basis. So we did it because the pandemic presented all of these obstacles. But I think that is a model for us going forward, not just for the pandemic, but for all times, because it made clear just people need a lot of support to do this. Even knowledgeable people who are paying attention and care about this and want to, exercise their civic liberties. People need support. And I think that's a model for how we can move forward with it.
We're speaking to Amel Ahmed, an associate professor of political science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and author of Democracy and the Politics of Electoral System Choice, Engineering Electoral Dominance. Amel, if government were to take an aggressive approach to affirming the right to vote, what would that entail?
So I think there's a lot that could be done to to take a more aggressive approach. But I will give you just one that I would start with, and I think this would be critical. I would start with giving people time off to vote. I think this is a structural feature that makes very clear how much of a laissez-faire approach to voting we have. People have to carve out their own time before work, after work, during work. It's managed privately. It's managed by each individual according to their own ability. It should not require that much work. So require employers to give people time off to vote. They are not required to vote, but if they choose to do so, they should have the time off to vote. And I think in addition to removing the logistical obstacle, this one change, and it would be a significant change, but it does so much more, because I think it helps to signal to people that this is an event and it's an activity. It's a reminder we have time off to vote. It's a reminder that this is happening. And more than anything, it makes voting more of a communal act, which I think has become less and less the case. It's become more of an individual activity, a private activity, and less of a public event. And so I would love to see legislation that required employers to give employees time off to vote.
Mm-hmm. You specifically highlight the work of Stacey Abrams. Why did you choose to focus on her?
I think, I recalled hearing interviews that she had done. And I remember thinking how lucidly she combined the framework of voting rights advocacy with the framework of mobilization. And that to me is really just the perfect marriage, that there is no voting rights advocacy without thinking through mobilization in terms of how to empower people, how to get them there, not just remove obstacles, but how to get them there. And it's not just her. I think a lot of organizations, a lot of voting rights groups do this organically because they realize that it's an extension of what they do. But she made it very explicit. And she said, it's not enough to focus on discrimination. And I think it's absolutely right. It's not enough to just focus on discrimination. You have to help get people there. And I think it's important because there are nefarious obstacles that we know about that try to prevent people from getting to the polls. But beyond that, there are many obstacles that just exist naturally. Even where there's no concerted effort to deny access, the whole system seems to work to deny access, to put the cost of voting higher than it should be. When you think through what people have to figure out just to make sure that they're going to the right place and they're registered and they've done everything that they need to do, logistically it becomes very difficult. Now, I really value Stacey Abrams and the work she's doing, and her whole advocacy network was really impressive. But I think even that has its limitations. And this is why, again, I think of it in terms of rights. This can't fall to private advocacy groups. And increasingly, I think it falls not just to the advocacy groups, but to political parties are in charge of that kind of mobilization. Historically, we've had lots of groups that were involved in that kind of mobilization. We've had labor unions, we've had religious establishments, we've had all sorts of groups that were involved in facilitating mobilization and helping people get to the polls. As those institutions have atrophied, we rely more and more on parties. Sometimes these advocacy groups, but their reach is rather limited. So most of the mobilization that takes place is taking place through parties, and more specifically through campaigns, where it's very strategic and very limited. And there are many people who are never going to have anyone knock on their door or give them a phone call to remind them to vote. I don't think this can be entrusted either to private advocacy groups or to campaigns.
Moving ahead, where else do you see the efforts taking place, and who do you envision can be effective in moving us toward a more encompassing embrace of voting rights?
I think it's going to come down to social movements and whether or not we can build enough of a social movement. And this, again, I go back to the example of economic rights. It wasn't any single group. There are lots of lobby groups and advocacy groups that were involved in this, a lot of politicians, but it was really a coalition. And that coalition started with the idea that this needs to be a right and it has to be secured. And it doesn't matter if it's in the Constitution. I will say there are people who are pushing for a constitutional amendment, and I completely support that. But we don't need to wait for a constitutional amendment. I think it's really about changing the frame. And for all of us, changing our ideas of what we can demand of our government. And it begins with that initial step to say, we can demand more, and we don't have to just take this defensive posture and be on our heels. It can be more of an affirmative push. But I think it will take a social movement. I think it will take a coalition of politicians, activists, advocates, and everyday citizens saying this has to happen.
It's a shame that this is such an ongoing uphill battle. If why people have to try and restrict others from voting is beyond me, other than they don't believe they can win if they don't. And that's absolutely wrong.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think it's those threats that keep us in this defensive posture, because there is a lot to defend against. That is absolutely for sure. But I think this is not a winning posture. I think if we really just keep playing defense, it's going to be at our own expense. And really, it's time to go on the offense, which is hard to imagine given everything that's happening. But it's time to really think more aggressively and more proactively about how we can think through this whole system and not keep finding ourselves in this same position over and over again. Throughout the past decades of U.S. history, voting rights advocates have found themselves in this same position of playing defense, litigating egregious acts piecemeal, focusing on individual cases because we don't have a framework to support the whole system. And so it seems like a tough time to be thinking of that when we're still playing defense on so many different fronts. But I think this is exactly the right time to be moving in that direction.
Absolutely. Amel Ahmed, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, author of Democracy and the Politics of Electoral System Choice, Engineering Electoral Dominance, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Amel, we would love to have you back again with us soon.
Thank you very much. I would love that.
Thank you for your time. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And we say hello to David Daley, Senior Fellow at Fair Vote, the author of Rat Effed, the true story behind the secret plan to steal America's democracy. And of course, his newest book is Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. David Daley, always nice to speak with you. Thanks for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks for having me back on.
Absolutely. We've spoken to you, obviously, before about the Republican campaign to establish minority rule. Remind us how they've been doing that and what it has meant for American voters.
Sure. 7 of the last 8 presidential elections, going all the way back to 1988, the Democrats have won the popular vote. Republicans obviously have controlled the White House for far more than simply 4 years. In that period, 5 of the 9 Supreme Court justices forming the conservative majority have been appointed by presidents that lost the popular vote. The U.S. Senate has a small state bias that even though Democratic candidates regularly win millions more votes for the U.S. Senate than Republicans, Democrats have to desperately fight to win 2 runoffs in Georgia, even to eke out a 50-50 tie. Republican gerrymandering gives them a big leg up in U.S. House races, as well as in state legislatures around the country, where there are now more than 50 million Americans who live in a state in which a chamber is controlled by Republicans, even though they won fewer votes in the last election. Those state legislatures then enact all kinds of voter suppression acts, voter ID bills, precinct closures, ending days of early voting, what we saw in the middle of a pandemic, in which state legislatures make it more difficult and force voters out to the polls to vote in person, even while the coronavirus rages on. And that's when those conservative justices packed into the Supreme Court and states' supreme courts around the country have their way, and they uphold many of these viciously anti-voter laws as constitutional, or they themselves interpret the Voting Rights Act, for example, in ways that eviscerate some of the key protections that American voters ought to be able to count and rely on.
Now that Trump is gone from the White House, Democrats have increased their political clout in Congress. You wrote recently in The Guardian that the Republican effort to game the system is hardly over. Where are you seeing signs of that?
Well, I think that what we saw, first of all, was that Republicans refused to admit or even recognize that Joe Biden was the elected president of the United States. It was not until early January, right, that many Republicans in Congress even were willing to address Joe Biden as the president-elect of the United States. The willful misleading of the American people in believing that this election had been stolen led to a mob insurrection on Capitol Hill. And after that mob was cleared out, you had 139 Republican members of the U.S. House who walked back in that evening past broken glass and bullet holes and voted to give those mobs exactly what they wanted, and voted to not certify electors from Pennsylvania and Arizona, despite the fact that those elections were free, fair, and perfectly legitimate. What we have also been seeing over the course of the last several weeks, new attempts in Texas, in Georgia, in Pennsylvania, and Minnesota to make it more difficult for voters there to cast ballots, new forms of voter ID bills, efforts that would wind back early voting, mail-in voting, and drop boxes in many of those states. What we have also seen in the last couple of days, efforts by Republican lawmakers in the states of Wisconsin and the states of Michigan to reallocate electoral college electors by congressional district rather than awarding them to the statewide winner. Under the kinds of bills that have been proposed, Donald Trump would have won 6 of the 10 electors from the state of Wisconsin, even though he lost the state. And Joe Biden and Donald Trump would have split the electors from Michigan, even though Biden won that state by about 145,000 votes. So we have got to have our eyes on what's happening in Washington. We've also got to have our eyes on what's happening in the states.
Mm-hmm. Voters return to the polls on November 8th, 2022. And once again, there will be intense focus on control of the Senate. Do you have reason to believe that Democrats might be able to expand their presence in the Senate?
It'll be an interesting year, right? The map for 2022 is not impossible for the Democrats. There could well be open races in Iowa if Chuck Grassley retires. That could be an interesting race. There will be open races in Pennsylvania, North Carolina, where you've got Republican incumbents who have already announced their retirements. You'll have what will be likely a very contested race in Wisconsin, where Ron Johnson is up for a re-election. But Democrats will also have to defend Raphael Warnock's seat in Georgia. They will have to defend Maggie Hassan in New Hampshire, potentially against the state's very popular Republican governor, in Chris Sununu. It's entirely possible that in Maryland, you might see the popular Republican governor, Larry Hogan, challenging Chris Van Hollen. Democrats are also going to have to potentially hold on to the seat in Vermont, where Patrick Leahy may or may not run for what I believe would be a 7th term. And there's a popular moderate Republican governor there as well, who's said to be eyeing that race. So it's going to be interesting. I think that the U.S. House is where Democrats really have to be worried. Democrats, if they lose 6 seats in the House, it would go to the Republicans. And you're going to have redistricting happen next year. Republicans are going to have additional seats in Texas that they'll be able to draw for themselves, as well as Florida. The new maps that they will have power to draw in North Carolina and Kansas and Kentucky will probably net them 4 or 5 additional members right there. Add Texas and Florida onto that, and I think Democrats start behind the 8 ball in the attempt to hold on to the House in 2022.
Given the pandemic, the horrible economic outcome because of that pandemic, the first 6 months of the Biden administration suddenly, to me, seem to be very key, as opposed to, say, the first full year. How important are these first 6 months to a year in terms of 2022?
I think they're crucial. I think that if Democrats don't use this period to enact meaningful, thoughtful democracy reform, this could be the last best chance they have for quite some time, given the fact that the House is extraordinarily likely to change hands in 2022. There are a couple of really smart, thoughtful bills that are before them. There's House Bill 1, the For the People Act, that would mandate independent redistricting commissions for Congress, that would do a lot to regulate dark money, to ensure that the state elections standards are fair and equal state by state. A lot of really impressive things in there. And then you've also got HB 4, which is the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, that would restore the crucial preclearance provisions that the United States Supreme Court gutted in the Shelby County versus Holder decision, that essentially really opened the floodgates for the kind of voter suppression efforts, the turbocharged efforts that we saw emerge from state legislatures in Texas and Mississippi and Georgia and Alabama over the course of these last 7 years. Democrats have an opportunity here that they may not have for a long, long time. Democracy itself could depend on it.
My thinking is that if you get everybody immunized and you get everybody back to work, a lot of your problems might go away. I mean, in terms of getting things back in, and all of a sudden people have a different, well, maybe this guy isn't so bad kind of thing. And maybe Democrats aren't so bad kind of thing.
I think that's right. I think if Democrats can show that they can govern, that would go a long way, especially after the last 4 years, which have been fairly chaotic, after a vaccine rollout that has been extraordinarily inefficient, and a federal government response to a public health crisis and an economic crisis that has just been woefully inadequate. If Democrats are able to come in and do some, actual competent governing, that could go a long way. At the same time, the structural problems are so deep and serious, and they favor the Republican Party. And Republicans have leaned into that, and they've exploited and exacerbated those structural weaknesses in American democracy. The small state bias of the Senate, the biases of the Electoral College, the power that they have by gerrymandering. And they have made it clear that they're not going to back down on that approach. They are not particularly interested in competing for every vote in a vibrant multiracial democracy. They have made it their project instead to govern from an older, whiter, more rural, conservative base. And what we need to do is enact the kind of democracy-saving reforms that incentivize the Republican Party to change and go out and compete for every vote again.
We're speaking to David Daley, senior fellow at Fair Vote, author of Rat Effed, the true story behind the secret plan to stealing America's democracy, and his newest book, which actually just recently out in paperback, Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. And David, in Unrigged, you tell the very important story of how people are fighting to protect democracy. Tell us about Kate Fahey.
This is one of my favorite stories in the book. I'm glad you asked. I mean, Michigan's one of the most gerrymandered states in the country. Democrats have won more votes for the state house there every single year for the last 10 years, and they've not controlled a single chamber there all decade. And Republicans have used that time to enact all kinds of brutal anti-labor laws, anti-environment laws, anti-reproductive rights laws, you name it. And so Katie Fahey, on the morning after the 2016 presidential election, she's thinking ahead to Thanksgiving in her house, and there's Sanders voters and Hillary voters and Trump voters, and she's imagining that there's going to be mashed potatoes and gravy flying through the air. And she says, I want to do something that will that everybody can maybe agree on. And she says, how about if we fight gerrymandering? Because gerrymandering, you ought to be able to agree that that's bad, no matter what your politics are, that the people ought to pick their representatives, that the politicians shouldn't choose their own voters. And she puts it on Facebook. She goes up and she writes a social media post and says, I want to do something about gerrymandering in Michigan. If you want to as well, join me. And then she writes a smiley face emoji. And you know what? Tens of thousands of people wanted to do something about it. Michigan is one of those states where good ideas go to die. It's really hard to get an initiative on the ballot in Michigan. They were the first group ever to get an initiative qualified for the ballot in Michigan without going out and having paid petition signature gatherers. And then even though the Koch brothers and the Mercers and the DeVosses and the Chamber of Commerce and all these people spend money trying to kill what they were doing in the courts, they lost. And Katie Fahey and her team won with more than 60% of the vote in November of 2018. And so the lines in Michigan for the state legislature and Congress will be drawn by citizens, by voters, not politicians, in 2021. And it's going to make a huge difference there as far as fair representation.
It'll be a good example for the other states that have not such a great record on gerrymandering. My state of Virginia has moved towards that, where it's going to be split between citizens and folks in office, but that's better than what it was. So it's progress. And you also tell the story of Desmond Meade from Florida. Why was his story important to include in your book?
Desmond Meade is really one of the unsung democracy heroes in this nation. Desmond ran what was a winning campaign in Florida to end felon disenfranchisement, the act of taking away someone's voting rights forever after a felony conviction, even after they finish the sentence and serve their time. And Florida was one of the last states in the country that did that. It dated all the way back to the Jim Crow era. It was a deeply racist way of trying to ensure that it was harder for blacks to vote in the state of Florida. And it endured all the way up until 2018, when Desmond Meade builds this moral movement of left and right and black and white and Democrats, Republicans, Independents in the state of Florida, wins a constitutional amendment that hands 1.4 million people in Florida back their voting rights. And it is one of the largest expansions of voting rights since the Voting Rights Act itself. The other reason why this story I think is so important is because Florida's gerrymandered legislature immediately moves to undercut it. And even though 64% of the people in Florida voted to end this racist Jim Crow relic, Florida's legislature essentially doubles down on racism, and they add a poll tax on top of it. And they say, okay, well, you can have your right to vote back if all of your fines and fees associated with the sentence have been paid. And how much do you owe? Well, we can't tell you the answer to that. And so instead of 1.4 million people being able to vote in 2020, as the people of Florida wanted, about 31,000 were able to register and cast a ballot. So I think it is real evidence not only of how most Americans want to see fairness, but that Republicans in office will do anything they can to hold on to their entrenched minority rule and to make it harder for people to vote rather than easier. And I think it's a sign that we can have our hands on that, on Dr. King's a long arc of moral justice, but the other side has got their hands on it as well, and they're pulling it in the opposite direction.
Yeah, absolutely. The stories you tell aren't about highly paid lobbyists. You write about grassroots activists. When there are so many issues that need activism, such as racial and economic justice, what draws these activists to voting rights?
The fight for voting rights is what animates all other fights. You can't fight for racial and economic and social justice when the rules are bent in such a way that the other side always wins. We've got to fix the structure of the rules before you can fight everything else. A story out of Michigan, which is in the news again today. In Michigan, the gerrymandered legislature there enacts an emergency manager bill about a decade ago, right? And that allows the state to step in and take over a city if its finances are in trouble. And the people of Michigan didn't like that. They saw it as an encroachment on home rule. And they went to the polls in 2012 and they overturned that. The state lawmakers there wasted no time, about 3 or 4 weeks, before they went and they put the emergency manager bill back in. And this time they said that you can't overturn this via statewide initiative. And then they handed control of Flint, Michigan to an emergency manager. And that emergency manager in Flint, Michigan switches the water supply there to the Flint River, and it sparks a Legionnaire's disease crisis, and kids get lead poisoning and a dozen people die. This is related to gerrymandering. People did not want this. People voted to overturn this. But what the people wanted didn't matter because the lawmakers were insulated from that because of the districts that they drew. So everything begins at the ballot box. And until we have that straightened out, we're not going to have the racial, social, and economic justice that this nation deserves and demands.
As we all watched Trump's desperate attempt to overturn democracy, what was the message American voters were hearing about elections, and what might be the impact on the movement for voting rights?
That's a great question. I worry that two different groups of Americans got two different messages. On one hand, I think it's clear that there is real urgency for democracy reform and that Democrats need to act quickly. But what we're also seeing in the polls, there's a new poll out today from Morning Consult that shows that there's a 37% drop in Republicans' trust in free and fair elections. So Republicans have been told now repeatedly by the president, by members of Congress, over and over and over again, that there was some kind of fraud in this election, that it was illegitimate. It's not true. It's groundless. It's baseless. Courts have rejected this as evidence-free. Republican appointed judges, Democratic appointed judges, it doesn't matter. There is no evidence of any actual voter fraud in this election, let alone the voter fraud that would lead to a different result. But Republicans are going to use that phony belief as justification to try to do additional voter suppression efforts. And Democrats have got to take advantage of this moment to bring real democracy reform, not so Democrats can win, But so elections are fair, so that maps are fair, so that every voice counts, that every voice is heard, that every voter in every state has got equal access to the ballot box. And also so that our politicians are incentivized to behave and to compromise with one another again. Until we fix democracy and some of these structural reforms that make so many districts uncompetitive, we're going to keep having Republicans who behave like the 139 members of the House Insurrection Caucus did on Wednesday. We need real democracy reform if we want to remain a democracy.
Amen. David Daley, Senior Fellow at Fair Vote, author of Rat Effed, the true story behind the secret plan to steal America's democracy. His latest book, now out on paperback, Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. David, as always, we appreciate your time with us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Looking forward to doing it again soon.
Always a pleasure. Anytime. Thank you.
Thank you. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats.
Social Security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America. Whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. And we say hello to Greg Sargent, who writes the Plumline blog for the Washington Post. Greg, thanks for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
Our pleasure to have you with us. In January, you wrote about whether Joe Biden's policy agenda can do what can seem like the impossible, which is to unify the country. To begin with, how important should unifying the country be to the Biden presidency?
Well, I think it really depends on what the phrase is taken to mean. Republicans right now are engaged in an extensive bad faith effort to define Biden's promise to unify the country as a promise to reach out to them and to water down his own agenda in order to win their support, which of course will never be forthcoming no matter what he does anyway. If we mean if we take that to mean unity, if we take unity to mean that, then I think obviously it's something Biden shouldn't be thinking much about at all. But in terms of what Biden really means by unifying the country is an end to the kind of ceaseless demonization of the opposition, an end to overt racism, an end to, constant permanent warfare against the parts of the country that didn't vote for you. And so I think that's an important feature of what Biden's going to be doing. And to the degree that he can get Republican voter and independent voter support for his agenda, I think that's also something that he's actually already doing. So It really depends on what we mean by the phrase.
Yeah, and I think probably more the latter than the former would be my guess. But anyway, one of the lessons that we have learned from Trump's 4 years is how it's not hard to divide people. Did you ever find yourself surprised at just how easy that was?
Well, I will tell you what really surprised me. Early on during the pandemic, I was looking at a fair amount of polling, and I was really pleased to see that large parts of the country were supportive of aggressive government efforts to contain coronavirus. And we're talking about parts of the country that were supposed to be on Trump's side on this stuff. So you could look at some of the early polling, which showed that, a solid majority of rural voters, a solid majority of non-college white voters who are supposed to be Trump's base, were all backing things like mask wearing, social distancing, aggressive government action to contain the pandemic, and so forth. But over time, the kind of ceaseless attacks on these things from Trump really did end up dividing the country on this stuff in a way that I didn't anticipate. And given what a no-brainer it was to act collectively in the face of such a major public health emergency, that was really distressing.
Yeah, and well, also, what got to me too was the smartest guy in the room was Anthony Fauci or Dr. Birx, one of those two. All you had to do was listen to them, and they just got brushed aside. As soon as they were saying things that he didn't like, they just got brushed aside, and his base is going to stick with whatever he likes. So.
Yeah, and not only that, but figures like Fauci became lightning rods to his base, which was just an extraordinary development. This really, I think that actually was something more pernicious than we, usually allowed for, because in doing that, this was basically a disinterested public servant. This isn't to say that he was perfect. Of course, he made mistakes and so forth, and but the thing is about his mistakes was that he would try to learn from them and adjust. The degree to which Trump, by attacking Fauci, was able to turn him into the enemy of a large part of the country was really kind of an astonishing development.
Yeah. Now, you write in the post, Biden's policy agenda is actually shaping up to be a unifying one, and you specifically write about Biden's COVID-19 policy in rural America. How do you understand Biden's purpose in aggressively directing resources to rural America during the pandemic?
Well, I think that is an effort to overcome kind of precisely the problem we're talking about here, which is polarization around the pandemic. If Biden can channel public health resources into the parts of the country that supported Trump, then one at least has to hope that these parts of the country will see that the president is undertaking an effort that's driven by a good faith effort to do what's in the common good. And that alone at least has a chance of overcoming some of these deep divisions around this stuff.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking to Greg Sargent, who writes the Plumb Line blog for the Washington Post. Now, the political impact, I'm wondering what kind of political impact that could this focus on rural America have during the pandemic? It may not turn rural America blue, but can it at least slow down the deepening divide?
Well, I think we're really going to have to see. One very encouraging thing is the broad majority support we're seeing for a lot of the policy proposals that Biden is trying to, put into law right now. Talking specifically about the $1.9 trillion relief package, which includes a whole lot of resources for reopening schools and for speeding the vaccine distribution and so forth. The fact that, a solid chunk of Republicans and a very large majority of independents support these things, I think does bode well. I will say, though, that really a lot is going to turn on how successfully these things are rolled out. A successful vaccine campaign, one that tames the pandemic, I think could go a long way towards kind of creating a sense of unity around common purpose, which, by the way, I should mention that early on during the Biden presidency, well, it's pretty early now, but very early on, I spoke to one of his public health officials about this, and they were very consciously and actively envisioning the vaccine rollout and the prospects for taming the pandemic as a way to restore a sense of common purpose and mutual obligation across the country. And I thought that was an interesting thing that they were thinking in those terms. Again, though, success, I think, is really the thing that will determine, whether that actually happens.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, if indeed one of Biden's goals is to unify the nation, He faces at least, and I say at least, two obstacles. One obstacle to a unity agenda is that there are some politicians, and you've noted this in some of your writings, that believe that it is their benefit to divide the country. They learned this even before Trump. Do you imagine this will continue to be a theme in the GOP?
Well, it's interesting because I think it's more complicated for some of those, what we might call Trumpy or Trumpist politicians after the storming of the Capitol. Note the fate of Josh Hawley. He was very consciously modeling himself after in the Trumpist model, thinking to himself that, well, if he questioned the outcome of the election and became the leading champion for Trump's efforts to overturn it in Congress, he could really become the fighter on behalf of the parts of the country that had decided that the election was stolen. And so you had the spectacle of him giving a big fist bump to the rioters outside the Capitol just before they, violently stormed the place and tried to subvert the election through force. And so he has spent the last, number of weeks defending that his role in all that and his role in propping up the lie that inspired all the insurrectionist violence. And so I think it's a little tougher for these guys now. They have to be a little more cautious about how they go about dividing the country to their own gain, because so much of the country has seen the horrifying consequences of that type of rhetoric and those types of lies. And so Hawley is doing his damnedest to still kind of stake out that place, but he's got to tread a lot more carefully now.
Mm-hmm. Another obstacle, Greg, to unifying the nation is the agenda Biden promised in his campaign. Some elements, such as expanding legal immigration, may never find acceptance on the right. Is there any way Biden can manage these policy shifts to be less divisive without selling out his own agenda?
Well, I have a working theory, and I hope it turns out to be right. It's an optimistic one. I'll grant that up front. But if Biden can deliver on the economy and on the pandemic, by which I mean if he can deliver a big rescue package that sends checks to people, delivers some aid to states, funds the vaccine distribution in a successful way, starts getting the schools reopened and so forth, then I think he actually buys some political space to do some of the stuff that we generally think of as being divisive, such as immigration and civil rights. And my hope is that if he can pacify the populism, the right-wing populism in the country by being successful on the economy, he then will be able to show that sensible management of immigration and progress on civil rights needn't be something that the usual people who you get backlash from on these things, these don't have to be things that prompt backlash and anger.
I think your hopefulness is probably better served now that we're in this new administration than perhaps it might have been a couple of years ago. So let's go with your hope and hope that you're right. Greg Sargent, who writes the Plumb Line blog for the Washington Post, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Greg, we appreciate your time with us. Would love to have you back again soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.